Welcome to Practical Parapsychology. Join your PhD host Drs. Brian Lath and Cindy Little as they arm you with the latest scientific research and know-how on ghostly phenomena. Brian is the lead author of the groundbreaking new book, Ghosted, Exploring the Haunting Reality of Paranormal Encounters, and Cindy is the proprietor of WacoGhost.com, a portal for professional investigations and public education on ghostly phenomena. Together, with their recurring guest, parapsychologist Dr. James Huren, they will take important steps with you to gain scientific answers about the nature of the paranormal experiences and the people who have them. For more information on practical parapsychology, visit their website at www.practicalparapsychology.com. Practical Parapsychology. The class is now in session.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Practical
Hey.
Parapsychology. How you doing, Cindy?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I am doing okay. So, again, hi, I'm Brian. This is Cindy, and we already did the hello bit. So, today, guys, we're going to get into a little bit of nitty gritty and talk about the role of formally measuring a person's paranormal belief and what some of the research findings are in terms of, how people's paranormal belief relates to traits and other values, as well as maybe how it applies a little bit to ghost hunting. This is the first thing you need to know as we're talking about this stuff is that, measures have been developed, I'd say for the last 40 or 50 years in, measuring formally, right, psychometric measures for actually assessing the degree of paranormal belief that a person has. But as Cindy is probably going to fight me a little bit, some of these findings are, shall we say, controversial. And I would also, kind of warn the listener up front that we may be poking a little bit, but there's a secret surprise ending near the end of the episode where we're going to explain some of these findings a little bit more in depth. Anything you want to add to this before we start rolling into some facts, figures, and details?
I do not. I'm going to give you the floor on these measures because you're a whole heck of a lot more familiar with them than I am. But, I did a little bit of research and kind of what they're measuring. And yes, I'm not going to say anything until a little bit further into the show on my thoughts on how well these scales represent people that have had anomalous haunt type experiences. I'm a little skeptical.
That's fair. And in fact, since we don't have Jim with us, I guess I'm again going to play the pseudo skeptic, right? In the sense of if Jim's not here, I'll do the hard hitting, dirty figures, and you guys can just pretend I'm him, and we'll work with it from there. So, without further ado, let's talk about the measure of paranormal belief. There have been several guys over the decades, but the one I'm most familiar with, and frankly the one that's most popular, was authored by a man named, I think it's Tubachik, right, in the late 80s, the Paranormal Belief Scale. And it originally had 7 subscales, and it has been used, I want to say, somewhere in maybe 60 to 100 peer-reviewed journal articles. It is a very popular measure for paranormal belief, both among mainstream scientists, parapsychologists, and, skeptical parapsychologists. Now, one of the things we want you guys to understand is that a lot of the research that was done with, Tubachik's paranormal belief scale was originally used with these 7 factors. And there'd be factors like, traditional religious belief in psi, right? Do you believe in ESP? Right? Things like, do you believe in extraterrestrial life? So there's actually a UFO subscale originally in paranormal belief, which I will say up front, I don't think belongs there.
I don't either. I think it should be parsed out. Same with cryptids, the whole cryptid UFO thing. Yeah.
So I want to say, and by the way, with due respect to the original researcher who's made a scale that people have really, really used over the years, I just never agreed conceptually with adding alien life forms to a paranormal belief scale, right? And I would also say I don't think really traditional religious beliefs belong in a paranormal belief scale, which, thankfully, Jim, early on in his career, well, I should say earlier on in his career, in 2000, him and some colleagues applied what's called rash scaling to the paranormal belief scale. And the reason I'm bringing this up, guys, is because it restructured the scale because rash scaling is from modern test theory. right? And I know I'm using a whole lot of technical terms right now. Bear with me. I'm trying to make this friendly. But the long and the short of it is, it's a better mathematical procedure for seeing how items on a scale actually go together or don't go together, right? So for those of you that aren't real familiar with psychometrics, we've brought it up a few times on the show. There is a very, very intense mathematical process and a procedure for creating a standardized scale. That's what makes scales that psychologists and researchers use different from what you're going to see on Facebook or from a polling center or things along those lines. Well, Jim's restructuring of paranormal belief led to two very, very, very reliable factors, right? Two components to paranormal belief. And the first one is traditional religious beliefs, right? So even though I don't necessarily agree with, a person's religious belief being inside a paranormal belief measure, one of the things that they found was there is this substructure in that particular measure where you're just getting things like, I believe in God, black magic is real, there is a devil. And let me map this out, because once you reframe paranormal belief into this sort of construct, right, of traditional religious beliefs or traditional paranormal beliefs, what you're really saying is, this is a person, someone that would score highly on this subscale of traditional religious beliefs, right? Traditional paranormal beliefs. They're going to frame paranormal events in what we might think of as a traditional Christian or, Catholic/Protestant religious framework, right? So people that score high on, traditional paranormal beliefs are going to see objects moving or scratches in the framework of, what we've seen in horror movies or what you might hear in a Baptist church, right? There are demons, there's the devil, there's God, there's angels, and that's it. Right. So if there's magic going on or there's weird supernatural forces doing odd things that you've witnessed, people higher in this subscale tend to associate that with the workings of the Dark Lord. The dark. So, right. And then we have the other factor, right? So that's, traditional paranormal beliefs. And then we have this other factor, which is New Age beliefs, right? Which is not necessarily, I would say, the best title. But really what they're saying is these are people who just actually believe in paranormal phenomena occurring, right? So, astrology is real. Objects can move on their own. So these are people that would embrace more sort of, and again, I don't like the label, but it's not that it's a bad fit necessarily, more New Age beliefs in terms of what humans can experience in the realm of the paranormal, right? So we end up, if we're going to, use the best form of paranormal belief, we're going to use the best, psychologically and scientifically divided method for separating these two. We end up with people who, will frame paranormal events in, a very traditional Christian religious context, traditional, paranormal belief, and then New Age belief, people who are just open or endorse the possibility that strange phenomena can occur, and sort of embrace that possibility, right? That's how the modern divide of paranormal belief is actually done now in most research studies at this point. I think the Roche version actually has taken over from the traditional version in most cases. Anything you want to add to that, Cindy?
Well, I mean, just listening to you, it just makes me think that really kind of what we're seeing here is you have two groups of people that have taken these tests, and they are interpreting anomalous activity as either, for lack of a better comparison, religious or spiritual / new age. And so they're still looking at these things through a cultural lens, which makes me wonder. I'm not familiar with these measures, but it makes me wonder how the questions were structured. I mean, did the creators of these measures kind of put people in a position of, exposing, for lack of a better word, exposing their beliefs? And if so, is that what they were looking for? Because to me, it's kind of like, I don't know, you're pigeonholing inadvertently or purposefully someone into a traditional religious interpretation of anomalous events or a spiritual interpretation of anomalous events.
Well, I hear your point, and I think to it, of course, there can always be additional aspects to a scale that could be measured. There's always caveats and nuances, right? A scale is only good as the items that you create to measure it.
Yeah.
And I will say, a lot of the research done on this scale originally was just from standard psychology 101 18-year-olds. Right. Which, for those of you that don't know, a lot of research data is collected from college students, right? Very often in their freshman and sophomore years. And one of the initial concerns I had with this scale was, well, okay, they're expressing these beliefs, but how many of these people actually have had experiences that guide or
Yeah.
shape their beliefs, as opposed to just being people raised with a belief system, right? Without the experience and projecting it. And of course, when you look at those papers, you don't necessarily see that distinction. And again, I'm not criticizing any of the researchers for obviously using participants in a college classroom. People do it all the time. But it does have sometimes some weaknesses in terms of generalizing. In other words, taking those findings and truly applying them to the real world, because obviously the whole world is not 18 to 21, predominantly middle class, predominantly Caucasian students. Right. Diversity, there's diversity issues there. There can be age issues there. But by the way, that's not a criticism of parapsychology. That can be a general criticism of science. Right. All of the mainstream fields very often will take data just from college students. And notably, they're not necessarily a representative group of people, right, across the entire world, or let alone the United States or Canada. Right.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And kind of to piggyback off of what you just said, yeah, it kind of makes me wonder if this paranormal belief scale is, given to college students who haven't had anomalous experiences, is it actually more of an accurate measure of their religious beliefs or of their new age beliefs when interpreting hypothetical paranormal events?
And I think that hypothetical is an important point, but again, let's drive this home. It is a paranormal, quote unquote, belief measure. So it is assessing what it's supposed to assess, right? But again, right, notice that our beliefs are very, very different, right? One of these dichotomies we're always going to come back to in this show is belief is different than the evidence that you've collected. Right?
Yes.
Belief is different than experience. And it is always this interaction of belief and experience that ends up creating the narrative of, the world that we live in for each of us, let alone a haunting experience or a ghost encounter or, a Bigfoot encounter, as the case may be. So our, first part here is introducing you guys to this kind of 2-component model of paranormal belief. We are going to backtrack on it in a second as we talk about some associated findings. But you're going to find near the end of the episode that kind of making this distinction between traditional paranormal beliefs versus new age belief is really relevant in terms of what happens in the haunting field. And with that, we're at time for our break. So we'll be right back with Practical Parapsychology.
Beautiful Mind Coffee is delicious coffee your brain will love. Made with ethically sourced 100% Arabica coffee grown in the volcanic soil of the Tolima, Colombia region, Beautiful Mind Coffee is roasted and ground in small batches to ensure each bag contains a wonderful full-bodied artisan coffee. Beautiful Mind Coffee contains herbal ingredients to aid in boosting your daily mental clarity and focus. Maca root powder, green tea extract and American ginseng have all been selected for their ability to support good brain health. Taking care of your brain's health now can help delay or prevent the onset of cognitive dysfunction, including dementia, Alzheimer's, and more general memory loss as you get older just by enjoying the delicious flavor of our roasted coffee and herbal ingredients found exclusively in Beautiful Mind Coffee. For more information on Beautiful Mind Coffee, visit us online at www.beautifulmindcoffee.ca. Beautiful Mind Coffee is now available at amazon.ca.
Welcome back, everybody. Okay, so we are discussing paranormal belief and its substructures of traditional paranormal belief and New Age belief. And this is where things start to get a little iffy. Um, here we go. We're about to offend everybody on
Yes,
the show,
here
at
we
least the
go.
paranormal, right? So, all right, guys. There are researchers that have made a career of really looking at various traits, but also more importantly, mental health that is associated with paranormal belief. And so I'm going to do a little introduction here, and I want to make a caveat before I go into this and say, look, here's the deal. These are people that have done a lot of good science. And at the end of the day, some of what you're going to hear you may not like, but whether we are believers or skeptics, good research data is good research data. We are stuck with the findings, right?
Mhm.
Now, what do the findings mean? Right? That's where, interpretation is not only important to go through, right? To really look at, what's going on. But we also have to remember that different psychologists and different researchers are going to have different biases about what relationships mean. And this is some real inside baseball with science. But by the way, this is true with any field that you look into, whether it's, biology, whether you're looking at pharmaceutical companies, medicine. It's the same thing with psychology and parapsychology. The relationships, if you've done the good science right, then, the relationships and the predictions you've made are real relationships and real predictions. Where a lot of people get into the fight is what those predictions and relationships actually mean, right?
Mhm.
So this is where we're going to go into this. That's my one caveat before we go into this. And like I said, we got a quick surprise for you at the end of the episode. But prominent researchers have kind of divided all of the findings with paranormal belief into what you would call the psychodynamics functions hypothesis, right? Because that's an easy thing to say. Psychodynamic functions
Yeah,
hypothesis.
say that 5 times fast.
and what's referred to as the cognitive deficits hypothesis, right?
Mhm.
So here's the deal in a nutshell. There is a fair amount of research out there, and by fair amount, I mean a good 20, 30, 40 research articles by various authors who associate various aspects of mental illness with greater degrees of paranormal belief, right? Now, I'm going to go into that in a second, but I also want to make the caveat and say most of those studies did not use the new version of the scale that Jim and I and Cindy use, right? So in other words, they did not use the Roche scaled version of paranormal belief. They used the old one with 7 subsets, right? To use a total scale in most cases. And there's a difference, right? If you cut up a scale and make it different, findings tend to become different. But the earlier work, mostly in the late 80s through the 90s and the early 2000s, I haven't seen as much of it because, frankly, super materialist skepticism is kind of been on the decline in the last decade and a half.
Yay!
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 Well, thank God, right? Yay!
Yay!
Not like you could ever make a solid philosophical claim for that stuff anyway, but hey, that's all right.
Okay.
But no, so we're looking at, when you start to look at older paranormal belief research, you see that it is associated with things like bipolar experience. It's associated with depression. It's associated with mania, right? And in some cases, magical ideation, right? Hypomania. And so what we're looking at is this whole bevy of relationships between paranormal belief and what we might call subclinical or clinical levels of what's known as mental illness, particularly in kind of the depression area, in the mania area possibility, right? So we're talking about, mild associations. And when I say that, I want to make this clear. These relationships are not large. If you were to break them down and turn them into percentage, you're looking at maybe anywhere between a 10 to 15% association, right, between paranormal belief and these, quote unquote, diagnosable features, diagnosable mental illness features. But, Cindy, what do you have to say about that before I add some more caveats to it?
Well, the thing that really kind of jumps out at me here is, okay, yes, they're correlating or attempting to build a case for paranormal belief being associated with various mental illnesses. What I'd like to know is, did these researchers, were they purposefully looking for that? What were some of the other measures that they were correlating with paranormal belief. I mean, obviously, depression, anxiety, there's a bunch of them here. Schizotypy. I mean, is this what they were looking for? Were they giving people,
Yes.
were they giving subjects, okay, we're going to give you something on paranormal belief, and then we're going to give you a depression scale. And what I think would be a little more even-handed is if people would, maybe from this point forward, look at paranormal belief, but also shine the light on other things, perhaps creativity, intelligence, things that are a little more positive. I mean, it's kind of like you're going to find what you're looking for. And that's the impression I got.
Well, okay, so you bring up a very powerful point. So let me address that in 3 points. Well,
Okay.
we'll say 2 and maybe a third. Yeah, you've talked to me for a long time. You know how this goes.
I do.
Well, first off, yes, in terms of science, guys, a very practical tip here is you can't control for things you don't measure.
Mhm.
Right. So I used to make examples in class and say, if you're going to measure anxiety and depression, but you're not going to take down what gender the people are, right, what their sex is, you don't know if there's a difference between men and women because you didn't measure it. Right. That's a limit that is a very real limit of doing science. If you haven't taken measurements for it, you don't know what it's doing in your data, and you don't know what it's doing in your findings. So to your point, Cindy, yeah, you're absolutely right.
Mhm.
These people were looking for relationships with mental illness and paranormal belief.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying they're wrong for doing it, right? I mean, we have to look in all directions. I want to kind of support the research in general, but I will say to your point that,
Mhm.
these were individuals that when you read the literature honestly and openly, very much have kind of a presupposition that anyone believing in paranormal belief having paranormal belief must not be an okay individual, right? That there
Yeah.
must be like, oh my goodness, they still believe in these antiquated blah 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 blah
Mhm.
blah blah blah, and
Huge,
yeah.
huge bias.
Yes,
Huge.
it is. It's a huge research bias.
Yes.
My personal response to that is, well, of course people can believe in that stuff, and they probably should, right?
Mhm.
To various degrees. So yes, there was very much in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, very much kind of a mainstream materialist bias in
Mhm.
trying to degrade I guess what we might say the reputation of paranormal believers. But I will also say I've run into many clients who do qualify for a mental
Mhm.
diagnosis, and they've had paranormal experience and they have paranormal belief.
Mhm.
If you want me to tell you with a straight face that there's not any kind of relationship between these phenomena and paranormal or mental illness and paranormal belief, I would say no, that's probably not the case. It is there. It's just not the end all be all. It's not 100% relationship. In fact, again, it's a 10 to 15% overlap. Not
Yeah.
that I'm claiming to be the most sane person in the world, but I would also make the very important note that there is a difference between a formal diagnosis of a mental illness and
Mhm.
having what are called subclinical features, right? And that's very fancy speak for look, you have a little bit of this tendency, but it is not enough for you to need a formal diagnosis or for you to need treatment or therapy. Right. A lot of people don't realize this, but being someone that regularly deals with clinical psychologists as part of my business, and the DSM-5, right, the Bible of diagnosis for mental illness, you have to meet a certain degree of criteria, guys, to qualify for a
Mhm.
mental illness. And there are, and there's not, and it's somewhere, maybe a clinician will back me up. There are very much, well, let me reframe because I just flubbed that whole thing. There's not a diagnosis in the DSM-5. There's not a diagnosis that a psychiatrist or a psychologist can give you that is not simply an extreme exaggeration of existing traits, thoughts, and behaviors that normal people have. All mental illness is an extreme, right? An extreme
Mhm.
exaggeration of things that everybody experiences. Right.
Mhm.
Cindy, surely there was a time when you were delusional as a teenager because you just knew this boy liked you, right? Well, guess what? You were delusional. He didn't. right?
Oh, no, he did. He
Oh,
really
okay.
did. He really
Well,
liked me
yeah,
that
yes.
much.
So,
Yeah,
okay,
he really
okay.
did.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, I'm more of a loser. There was certainly a time that I wanted to believe, right? And as a teenager, that some girl was into me, and she simply wasn't, right? Now, do we need to diagnose that teenager? No, that's normal. Everyone gets sad, right?
Mhm,
When you're grieving, you're gonna get real sad.
mhm,
And if it persists long enough, it might be something called adjustment disorder. It's a temporary diagnosis that's not supposed to last longer than 6 months, and it just represents grieving, right?
mhm,
Um, but again, just because we see these small relationships here, I want to make it clear we're all human beings.
mhm.
And whether we have parent, and by the way, note that these studies don't talk about what the rate is between people who don't have paranormal belief, right?
Yeah.
So, again, it is true, but we have to put it in context. That, of course, we're going to see some of the population that have paranormal experiences that have had a tough go of it, or maybe do qualify for depression or anxiety, or maybe have some mania. Okay.
Mhm,
Does that mean by definition that what they believe and what they've experienced is somehow invalid? That's the real secret of this, right? That's
mhm,
that's the real heart of it, which is, no, there's no reason for us to claim that just because you have some sort of diagnosis on
mhm.
whatever, right, in whatever area of the DSM-5, that not only your beliefs are invalid, but your experiences are invalid. We wouldn't make that claim anywhere, would we?
No, and I think that's a really good point, but there again, as I was thinking about this entire thing, I mean, you were talking about, yes, you have had encounters with people that have mental illness and paranormal belief, and I mean, okay, say you take your group of subjects there that you've observed this in. I don't think it's fair to generalize that to an entire population. And that's what really bothers me is, I read these articles and it's this generalization to this population that, okay, everybody that has paranormal beliefs, has some sort of mental illness. And that is a huge, unsubstantiated leap.
Yes, it is. And that is the perfect statement for another break. And we'll be back in just a moment with practical parapsychology.
Mm.
So I was watching the XZone TV channel last night when I was abducted by aliens, and they kept repeating to me over and over again, simultv.com, simultv.com.
What's simultv.com?
That's what I asked them. They had it written on the side of their UFO.
How do you spell that?
UFO.
No, I mean simultv.com.
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 Right. simultv.com.
Interesting that you were abducted by aliens in a simultv.com UFO last night.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, now that you mention it, I remember now last night I was awakened from a deep sleep. My great-grandmother was standing there. She said she come from the hereafter to tell me about simultv.com. She even spelled it out for me.
simultv.com, sonny boy.
simultv.com.
simultv.com, sonny boy.
Wow.
Yeah,
Guys, you'll never guess what my psychic guru just told me.
simultv.com.
Exactly. Are you guys psychic too?
Of course.
We all know about simultv.com. simultv.com.
Welcome back, everybody. So if we didn't do enough damage to believers' egos, and I'm one of them, so I guess we're doing damage to me too, we're going to add to that and talk about the second grouping of research with paranormal belief, referred to as the cognitive deficits
Oh,
hypothesis.
this
Um,
one really gets me.
yeah,
I'm
yep.
sorry.
Well,
Yeah.
Well, Cindy, how do you think we should interpret the term cognitive deficits hypothesis? What do you think that means?
That means that only stupid people believe in paranormal phenomena.
Yeah, in a nutshell, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, let me give you some good news, folks. First of all, the research in this area, there have been several studies that have looked at different modes of thinking, right? Analytical thinking and IQ tests. Here's the good news. The relationships are not consistent. In fact, in that body of literature, it is, some people will find positive relationships between analytical thinking and low paranormal belief versus intuitive thinking and paranormal belief, which is traditionally higher. Right. There's been, Ravens, matrices, intelligence tests applied to people with paranormal belief. And here's what you need to know in the sum of these kind of findings. One, they're inconsistent. They don't get them consistently. And so, going back to our earlier discussion, you have to ask yourself, well, what was that sample like? Where did you get that sample? What was the breakdown of that sample? What was their experience? What was, et cetera, et cetera. So, that's one way to possibly explain those findings, right? And, two, the relationships, again, for the most part, are not large. Again, we're looking at another, 0.3 to 0.4 correlation on average. So, roughly 10 to 16% accounted for. So even if it is a legitimate finding, it's certainly not a large one. And it certainly doesn't apply to the bulk of all people who have paranormal belief. It's basically saying, if you want to get mathematical about it, that the higher your very high paranormal belief scores could add up to, or decrease, 10% on your IQ test. And I'm not even sure I'd stick with that officially as an explanation. Or you might say that, if you wanted to buy the studies and assume they're constant, that being high in paranormal belief would increase your intuitive reasoning, right? Versus your analytical reasoning by about 10%. And obviously, Cindy, you're just looking mad over there. So go ahead, go off, go for it.
Well, I mean, like I said, there again, I'm not really as familiar with the body of literature that you are, as you're a lot more familiar with it. I'm frustrated about this. And this is really encouraging me to get more familiar with it because, I'm looking at they mentioned the Raven intelligence tests or the matrices, and there are a lot of other intelligence tests. What did they control for? Did they control for religious belief? Did they control for ethnicity? Did they control for gender? Did they, what did they use for their analytical thinking measures? Were they valid and reliable tests? There's so many things. And I mean, I really want to bring this up here at this point, and that is there's kind of a general belief out there that science is objective. And when you read a scientific study, it is the objective truth. And I have to tell you, that is not the case. I mean, we try to be as objective as possible, and the scientific method is very useful, but it has its limits. Scientists have their limits. And if you really start getting into, well, how is this study designed? What measures were used? How were subjects gathered up for this? And how are you rationalizing a generalization to a population? And so I look at all of these things, and there's a lot more to it. And I mean, what I'm seeing is this broad swath being painted of, hey, you believe in ghosts, you're an idiot. And it's like, to me, that's irresponsible. I mean, it just really bothers me.
Well, and let's talk about your feelings for a minute, Cindy. So others, let's get a little bit to the heart of this, because if you heard me earlier, and I understand if you didn't, one of the more common measures that are used is intuitive versus rational thinking styles, right? And I want to break this down a little bit. Oh no. People with high paranormal belief use more of an intuitive thinking style. Well, why is that a bad thing exactly?
Exactly. It's not a bad thing.
That's my point in that you're right. The way that the data is interpreted, but I want to keep coming back, because I don't want the listeners to go like, oh, well, we should throw out that data because it doesn't say what, it's not the findings, guys. It's how it's interpreted. And sometimes how it is not used in a fair and objective way. And I want to make it clear, if you think you're only going to find that sort of bias in parapsychology, I encourage you to go on Google.
I laugh.
Google Scholar right now and start looking up papers, and you will find all sorts of unjustified assumptions that are being made before the analysis is even being done. You're right, Cindy, because in today's world, science has gotten much more funded, both from large private industry and government. And unfortunately, that means they get asked to make these broad generalizing statements, right? For the listenership, guys, and hopefully you don't find this boring, but it's worth you knowing, I believe. The average research paper takes, if it's just like me and you, Cindy, we might spend 6 to 12 months doing one paper.
Yeah.
Right. And one paper will have somewhere between 40 and 65 other papers that it's referencing.
Yes.
Right. And then, it's anywhere from 18 to 30 pages single spaced, right? With all these references, with all the method and all of this data and analysis. And now let's take that paper and turn it into a 25-second news clip.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm so glad you said that. I'm so glad you said that. Yeah. And then people will take that 25-second news clip and say, oh, scientists say, the research says, and then they see it as God's honest truth. And it's like, no. And I mean, your point is a really good one. And I really, really want to encourage all of our listeners out there. I mean, get on Google Scholar. Try to become a savvy consumer of research. And I mean, hey, I know reading some of these articles is about as exciting as watching paint dry.
What are you talking about?
I know. Ours are extremely exciting. Yeah.
No, not dry.
But I mean, you're going to start seeing this structure of how they're built, with literature reviews and support from others' theories and studies. You're going to see methods and just start familiarizing yourself with how science is done.
Yes.
And then from there, you can jump off and say, okay, well, this methods section, this is the recipe. This is the recipe they followed. And then just start asking questions, about, well, how did they find these people? Well, why did they give these particular measures? Why did they control for these variables? And that's, as you're starting to get into those details, that's going to give you a clearer picture of what was studied, as well as reveal the bias in the study.
Well, and I'm gonna go on a small soapbox here and add to that, Cindy, in the sense of, guys, we're happy you're listening to us, but I do not have to be a conspiracy theorist to make a very simple claim and say, when there's lots of money involved in research, you might want to be a little suspicious of those findings, because, the example I used to use is, would a large fast food restaurant chain pay $2 billion for a research study, looking into whether or not their food was healthy? Right. And if they do you really think those findings are going to show that the food's bad for you? Who gets that kind of money and is not tempted? Right. That's just a human worry. So as government and large industry starts paying large amounts of money, right, for research, which turns into advertising and commercials and sometimes pharmaceutical commercials and everything else. You might want to take the time for your own consumer wisdom and health to start educating yourself on the basic mathematics and the basic research that goes into the claims that you hear on the news or on commercials on a regular basis. Because we live in a world where there's a lot of money going around, and we all know that money can sometimes get people to say and do things that they probably shouldn't.
And that's an excellent point, because you do want to look into that side of it as well. It's like, who's signing the paychecks for all these scientists? Well, it's usually big corporations or the government. And it's like the people that hold the purse strings, they may want certain results. And that's always kind of this pressure that's put on researchers. Yep. And so you want to be, who funded this? That's another question to ask. Who funded this research? Because that's going to tell you a lot.
Well, but I do want to back up and say, even though we've kind of gone off into, hey, as a citizen scientist, please educate yourself on science. It will save your maybe
Yeah.
save your life and money.
Yeah.
I got to be clear. We're not invalidating these studies, though,
No.
when we're talking about paranormal belief, right?
No.
They're legitimate studies. Maybe Cindy and I think that more things should have been looked at, right?
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, they're solid studies, and the findings are the findings, right?
Yes.
To be clear, where we might take issue is how they were interpreted.
Yes.
So to that point, let me go ahead and hit you with a little bit of surprise. What Cindy is expressing is exactly how I felt when I first entered into parapsychology. So one of my first studies was to actually run a replication of some of these studies with paranormal belief, and I looked at all sorts of different personality traits, and I looked at rational and analytical thinking, right? And I applied it directly to a sample of people who either had or had not actually had paranormal experience. So, in other words, I purposely wanted to see if there were differences for the reasons that Cindy brought up, right? Well, okay, we have a bunch of people in a classroom that are going to take a paranormal belief scale. How many of them are just regurgitating belief versus how many people of them have actually had paranormal experience? And here's my, drum roll surprise. When we looked at the sample of people that had had haunting experiences, we found none of the relationships between them being either mentally ill or neurotic, or even really having differences in rational or in analytical or intuitive thinking styles. In other words, I made the whole paper based around the fact that haunters have been ignored. People that have had paranormal experiences, real experiences, right, have been ignored. And when you look at that group, guess what? They don't have those deficits. And actually, Jim Horan and I did a double study replication paper in 2019, and we put the same measures in plus some additional measures. And actually, what we found is, again, when you're looking at paranormal experience, where they're actually reporting what they've witnessed, so it's experience based. You don't find any of the trait differences. You do find a small increase in intuitive thinking style, right? But none of the deficits seem evident for people that actually have haunting experiences. What we do know predicts haunting experience is having new age paranormal beliefs, right? So if you believe it can happen, people tend to report more of those experiences. But more powerful than paranormal belief itself was transliminality, right? So we know that people that have what we call that thin boundary structure, where the environment, the conscious, and the unconscious information tends to flow more freely between those three, that out of all of those traits, personality variables, thinking style, all of those did nothing, right? But transliminality most strongly predicted those paranormal beliefs, right? Or not, I'm sorry, paranormal experience. In conjunction with, right, new age beliefs, the beliefs that they could occur in the first place. So, I certainly am not as much of an expert as some of these other researchers in paranormal belief, but I can say that I've now run 3 samples, and I've run them with people that have had paranormal experiences, right? And these findings do not seem to hold when you apply them to that specific population of people. In other words, guess what, guys? If you've had paranormal experiences, these findings may not apply to you. How's that?
I like that.
Yeah,
I like
more
that
excited,
a lot.
Cindy. Come on, give me some excitement. They're like,
yeah,
yeah,
yay, yeah. Well, and I look at that too, and kind of going back to belief and experience. I think that you're studying a population of people here who, for lack of a better term, they've had their bell rung. I mean, they have had this extremely weird, anomalous experience. And of course, they're going to interpret it through their beliefs. And the experience, in turn, is going to influence their beliefs. So I'm not surprised by that. And I've been saying for a long time that people that have paranormal experiences, their brains are wired up for it. And that, to me, is the transliminality piece of it.
Yep. The right person in the right environment. And it's time for
Yes.
another break, and we'll be back in just a minute with more practical parapsychology.
Beautiful Mind Coffee is delicious coffee your brain will love. Made with ethically sourced 100% Arabica coffee grown in the volcanic soil of the Tolima, Colombia region, Beautiful Mind Coffee is roasted and ground in small batches to ensure each bag contains a wonderful full-bodied artisan coffee. Beautiful Mind Coffee contains herbal ingredients to aid in boosting your daily mental clarity and focus. Maca root powder, green tea extract and American ginseng have all been selected for their ability to support good brain health. Taking care of your brain's health now can help delay or prevent the onset of cognitive dysfunction, including dementia, Alzheimer's, and more general memory loss as you get older just by enjoying the delicious flavor of our roasted coffee and herbal ingredients found exclusively in Beautiful Mind Coffee. For more information on Beautiful Mind Coffee, visit us online at www.beautifulmindcoffee.ca. Beautiful Mind Coffee is now available at amazon.ca.
Welcome back, everybody. Cindy, I have to say, and this is not a paid-for plug, I kind of want to get some of that coffee, but that's just me. I know.
Maca root. It reminds me of Star Trek. They talked about maca root.
So how about we make this a little? How about we move from the bad news and the spread? Let's make this practical for people that are out in the field, because one of the things we were discussing earlier, Cindy, is this kind of interaction between what we might call coolers versus non-coolers, right?
Yes.
So, for those of you guys that are investigators out there, we're assuming you've run into occasionally a person that if you send them in, nothing ever happens.
Yeah.
And we have always, I've always called them coolers, right? That's my nickname for them, because if things get too hot and heavy and people start freaking out, you send, Tommy in and be like, yeah, go in there, Tommy. And it just shuts down, right? It's like, I didn't see anything, right? And do you have experience with that too, Cindy?
Yes, I regularly investigate with a cooler. Yeah. Well, semi-regularly. He doesn't come on every investigation, but yeah. And I have some comments on that.
And so here's my next question, right? Because we've already been discussing this idea that paranormal belief predicts haunting experience. So, right, is there, what's the relationship here between being a cooler and being either a believer or a skeptic? Have you run into coolers that are believers and coolers that are skeptics?
No. I've run into coolers that are believers.
Okay. And you know what? That's mostly my experience as well. But I haven't necessarily run into a cooler who is a full-blown skeptic.
Me neither.
In fact, most of the skeptics I've run into that I've gotten brave enough and they're open-minded enough to come to a place that has some active phenomena, there's been several instances where we've had people get a little freaked out because they've actually witnessed psychokinesis and they don't know what to do with it. So, one of the questions, and guys, just to be clear, we're kind of scientifically spitballing here because, and this might, honestly, this would be a fun study to do, looking into people that seem to tamp down phenomena or never witness phenomena and what is their paranormal belief. Right. And are we going to see differences in the kinds of phenomena they do and don't report as a function of them either being a believer and being a cooler? Thoughts about that?
I don't know that it has anything really to do with belief, to be honest. I mean, the cooler experiences that I have had, I wonder if it has more to do with uneasiness, anxiety, fear. I ran across a study recently about sitter groups, where people are in
Bachelor.
Bachelor. Yeah. And in seances, and they were noticing that there were people that were very similar to coolers in these sitter groups that were inhibiting PK. And it's because they parsed it out that they were uneasy, because if they were prepped ahead of time to say, well, okay, you're going to go into this sitter group situation, but there's potential fraud, it seemed to kind of put them more at ease. And it's like, oh, well, then it's probably just fraudulent stuff that's going on. I just don't understand how the magician is pulling the strings. But that also opened them up for more genuine PK experiences. So I wonder if there's something going on similarly in these paranormal investigation situations, because I can tell you right now, the cooler that I have investigated with seems to get very uneasy, especially in like communication sessions. So I wonder if there's not this sense of fear. Now, I do not know if that's the case, if whether or not that would affect the environment and whether or not that would affect activity. But it almost to me kind of points in that direction.
Well, off the bat, and I'm going to channel a little Jim here. I've done some work with Jim where I was kind of supporting his research, where he's looking at liminal landscapes and also looking at this idea of enchantment, right? With the idea that there are positive and negative states of enchantment, and of course, there's research out there that very clearly shows that there is this relationship between anxiety and being in this liminal landscape, which is this fancy word for some things are very hard to pin down in terms of what is this, right? It's not up, it's not down, it's not left, it's not right. I'm having trouble categorizing some features of what's going on in this landscape. They're hard to define. And that does create a certain amount of dis-ease, right? Distress. Now, here's the thing, though. You can go too far. You can take it too high and people will freak out. You can take it, it can be, but if you ride that wave within a certain area, you eventually get to kind of this sort of mystical acceptance state where you have, to your point, opened up to the possibility of shall we say, spiritual or weird things occurring, right? You've gone with the flow, so to speak.
Yeah.
Into this weird space to have that full experience. And notably here, right? And there's not direct measures for it, but notably here, you would expect a person's resistance to go down, right? Their inhibition to events happening going down. But notably, as you said, if it's too much, if there's too much weirdness, if you get beyond their ambiguity tolerance, right? They're just gonna shut it down.
They're gonna shut down.
To the point in terms of a real life story, we had a gentleman once with us who refused to follow our protocols on investigations, right? And being a diehard skeptic was like, well, I'm going to go up to this room and I'm going to do it by myself. I'm like, well, you're a grown man. All right, have fun.
Go for it. Yeah.
About 25 minutes later, came down white as a sheet, got in his car and went home. And when we looked at the footage, he evidently was laying on a bed with some beach balls that were famous for doing PK, and one of them just popped right past him. And he looked around. He turned white as a sheet. Too much. It was too much. And rather than confront that, out the door he went. So yeah, I guess there's we're almost kind of working out a study here. On a live show, but no, I suspect the answer to cooler, not cooler might be their tolerance for the unknown, their tolerance for ambiguity, and their comfortableness in dealing with things that aren't within what they accept as real or normal.
Yeah, I think that should definitely be looked at. That would be a really, really interesting study. It's that whole thing, tolerance for ambiguity or cognitive dissonance. It's kind of like, how do I make sense of this weirdness? And some people are like, oh, wow, that's really cool. And others are like, I'm out of here.
In fairness, Jim's already done an anxiolytic model, right? It's actually in Ghosted. But you're right. We should try it out in the field. We should, find out a way to get people out in the field and to a putative haunted place, and see if they're willing to go with us, right? If we can, if we can get it ethically approved and we can get people to show up, see how they react to situations like that. We might get some cleaner answers, and also find out some contextual variables in terms of, where does the coolers come from, so to speak. So, as a wrap up for today, what do you think we should be talking about with the listeners in terms of their paranormal belief and how they apply it to the investigation?
Well, I don't want to be a snob, but
Snob.
I know. But I'd really like to hear from listeners who have had anomalous experiences. Um, I mean, uh, now, I mean, that sounds so snobbish, but it's kind of like I'm just very interested in if you've had an anomalous experience, a ghostly experience, I'd like to know how you interpreted that. Did you interpret it through how you interpreted that through the lens of your belief system, whatever that system is? And that's something that I would be really interested in.
Okay. Well, I'm going to be the heavy here and say, again, guys, if you're doing investigations and your goal is just to have the experience of haunting, right?
Mhm,
If you're going for the poops and giggles,
mhm.
don't worry about any of this. Go have fun, right? Be safe,
Yes,
do smart
yes.
things, don't
Don't
trespass.
trespass. Yeah.
And if you're here in America, don't go in the Midwest into a field. You're going to get shot. But
Yeah.
go do your thing. But if you're interested in getting to the bottom of some of this stuff, if you're interested in being scientific, again, this is something I struggle with all the time. Everyone struggles with this all the time. You've got to put a block between what you believe versus the evidence that you've collected.
Yes.
Right. It's we know there's a relationship. Surely having paranormal belief seems to facilitate paranormal experiences. And by the way, to be clear, we're not just talking about, oh, I feel a presence on the inside, but I can't prove it. There is a relationship between paranormal belief and external things happening.
Yep.
Video captured apparitions, objects moving, right? Cuts and scratches, people getting knocked down, right? And we can interpret that in various ways. But no, I want to make it clear, we're not just talking about, oh, well, I believe this, and on the inside, I had this experience. No, that relationship extends to objective paranormal events, right?
Yes.
So there's something going on there. But
Yeah.
again, I would encourage all of you, separate the data you're collecting, the evidence that you're collecting, from your interpretation of it. Because
Mhm.
unfortunately, right, and hopefully by now you all don't think I'm down on religious belief. I am certainly not, right?
Mhm.
But there's a lot of different people with a lot of different religious beliefs.
Mhm.
And so if we're doing, scientific evidence collection, then we have to be clear about what we actually witnessed and captured versus what we think it means. Because those are very much two different things. And you would note Cindy and I just harped on a bunch of researchers for not doing that, right?
Yeah.
Take your theology and your belief system and and get that away from the data. Be honest in how you interpret the data, right? Well, we'd be
Mhm.
hypocrites if we didn't tell you to do the same, right?
Mhm.
And expect us to do the same as well. Because at the end of the day, when we start assuming that a glass moving is a demon or your dead grandpa, right? Or,
Mhm.
Cthulhu rising up from the underwater depths to, consume mankind,
Yeah.
which hopefully would be a little bit more spectacular than just a glass moving.
Yeah.
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 Like, good job,
He
Cthulhu.
he was
Um,
thirsty.
yeah. Like, I just came up for a sip. Um,
Yeah.
but, again, all of that is interpretation. And at the end of the day, and by the way, I
Mhm.
value faith, but, that becomes a he said, she said game.
Mhm.
Right. So, Cindy knows because she is a Buddhist that it was an angry ghost, right, that moved the
Mhm.
glass. I'm a Christian. I believe it's a demon. Well, how do we prove that?
Yeah.
Right.
You really
And
can't. You
exactly, you
can't.
can't. And that doesn't make it wrong, but it does mean that it's not an area that science should be dabbling with, right? We don't mix our sports. You don't mix baseball with football, right?
Mhm.
And you don't mix theology with science.
Mhm.
Because they're not incompatible, but you can't just randomly cross them over and be like, everything's fine now, right?
Mhm.
Science requires evidence, and it requires you to limit your interpretation as a function of the evidence that you have.
Yes.
Which we all commit that sin of to a certain extent. In fact, that's probably, I think, the greatest thing that scientists who are trying to really be objective are always struggling with, right? Trying to
Mhm.
be very clean and clear about what the data they've collected does and doesn't say. So, as kind of a wrap up, because we're running out of time, if any of you guys didn't like these findings, you can always just claim that the entire field is biased, right?
Yeah.
But of course, my response to that would be like, well, no, they collected, good data on psychometric measures, so there's something to it.
Yes.
But yeah, guys, take home message for today when we're talking about paranormality is look at the evidence and then look at the beliefs that came with the evidence.
Yes.
Separate the two, and make a habit of doing so. And you will find very quickly that the things become a lot more clear. Maybe a little bit less exciting, fairness, right? Not quite as hooky spooky. But you do start seeing some honest patterns because you separated what you want to believe versus what the evidence says. Hard to do, but required if you're going to be a scientist. So on that note, any closing points, Cindy?
No, about the only closing point that I have is that sit down and take a really hard, honest look at your beliefs, and especially in your beliefs as they relate to the paranormal. Because that way you're going to have a template that you can use when you go into these situations and you're collecting data, and you can say, oh yeah, hold on, my beliefs are getting in the way here or there. But yeah, we all have personal paradigms. Get to know your personal paradigm, get to know those things that you just take as a given. God exists. That's a given. Demons cause glasses to move across the bar. That's a given. So you really just need to do a lot of self-examination before you go into the field.
And I agree with that 100%. So I thank everyone for listening to us today, and we'll see you next week on Practical Parapsychology. Have a good week, guys.